The old water spring had been feeding our family farm for 3 generations, but that Tuesday morning in October, it finally gave up on us. I stood there watching muddy water trickle from the cracked pipe, knowing this wasn't going to be a simple fix. The spring sat about 50 yards behind our farmhouse, nestled between 2 oak trees that my grandfather had planted when he first bought this land in 1952. My wife Sarah called from the kitchen window, reminding me that her mother was coming for dinner and we needed running water. I grabbed my shovel from the barn, muttering under my breath about timing. The pipe had probably been deteriorating for years, but like most things on the farm, we'd ignored it until it became a crisis. The ground around the spring was softer than I expected, probably from decades of moisture seeping through. As I began digging, I thought about my grandfather's stories of how he'd discovered this spring during his first week on the property. He'd said it was like finding buried treasure, a reliable source of the sweetest water he'd ever tasted. I was about 2 feet down when my shovel hit something that definitely wasn't pipe. The metallic clang echoed strangely in the quiet morning air. I assumed it was an old piece of farm equipment, maybe something my grandfather had buried and forgotten about. But as I cleared away more dirt, I realized this was something much more deliberate. The object was wrapped in what looked like oilcloth, carefully preserved despite being buried for what must have been decades. My hands trembled slightly as I lifted it from the hole. Whatever this was, someone had wanted it to survive underground for a very long time. Chapter 2. Unwrapping the Past. I carried the mysterious bundle to my workbench in the barn, my heart pounding with anticipation. The oilcloth was still intact, though darkened with age and earth. As I carefully unwrapped it, the smell of old leather and something metallic filled the air. Inside was a leather satchel, remarkably well preserved considering its underground burial. The satchel contained several items that made no immediate sense together. A stack of letters tied with a faded ribbon, a small metal box that felt heavy for its size, and what appeared to be a hand-drawn map of our property. But it was the photograph that stopped me cold. A picture of my grandfather as a young man, standing next to a woman I'd never seen before. The woman in the photograph was beautiful, with dark hair and kind eyes, wearing a dress that suggested the 1940s. On the back, someone had written Thomas and Elena, 1947, in careful handwriting. Thomas was my grandfather's name, but I'd never heard of anyone called Elena. My grandmother's name was Margaret, and according to family history, they'd been married since 1946. I opened the first letter with shaking hands. It was addressed to My Dearest Thomas, and signed, Forever Yours, Elena. The date at the top read, September 15th, 1947. As I read the passionate words of love and longing, I realized I was holding evidence of a relationship that had been completely erased from our family history. The letters spoke of secret meetings, stolen moments, and a love that was apparently forbidden. Elena wrote about waiting for Thomas by the old spring, about their plans to run away together, about a future that clearly never came to pass. Each letter revealed more of a story that no one in my family had ever mentioned. Chapter 3. The Weight of Secrets. I spent the rest of the morning reading through Elena's letters, each one revealing more about a relationship that had been hidden for over 70 years. The letters painted a picture of a passionate love affair that had taken place right here on our property, centered around the very spring where I'd made this discovery. Elena wrote about meeting my grandfather by moonlight, about their dreams of starting a life together somewhere far from the small town where they both lived. She mentioned obstacles, families who disapproved, social expectations, and something she referred to as the arrangement that was keeping them apart. The most disturbing letter was dated October 1947, just weeks after the others. Elena's tone had changed completely. She wrote about being frightened, about people watching her, about threats that had been made. She begged my grandfather to meet her one last time at their special place by the spring, saying she had something important to tell him. That was the last letter in the bundle. I opened the small metal box with trembling fingers. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was an engagement ring, a simple gold band with a small diamond that caught the barn's dusty light. Beneath the ring was a folded piece of paper with my grandfather's handwriting. For Elena, my true love. I'm sorry I wasn't brave enough. The implications hit me like a physical blow. My grandfather had been engaged to another woman before he married my grandmother. But what had happened to Elena? Why had their relationship ended so abruptly? And why had my grandfather buried these memories instead of simply throwing them away? I looked at the map again, studying the careful markings my grandfather had made around the spring area. Chapter 4. Following the map. The hand-drawn map showed our property in remarkable detail, but there were markings I didn't recognize. Small X's were scattered around the spring area, and there was a notation in my grandfather's handwriting that simply said, Elena's garden. I'd never heard of any garden near the spring, and in all my years on this farm, I'd never seen evidence of one. I decided to follow the map's markings, taking my metal detector from the barn. If my grandfather had buried one cache of memories, there might be others. The first X on the map led me to a spot about 20 feet east of the spring, near where an old fence post had rotted away years ago. The metal detector began beeping almost immediately. I dug carefully, and about 18 inches down, I found a small tin box. Inside were more photographs. Pictures of Elena working in what was clearly a garden, Elena laughing as she picked flowers, Elena sitting by the spring reading a book. In every photo, she looked radiant and happy. There was also a pressed flower, still maintaining some of its color after all these years, and a small piece of paper with what looked like a recipe written in Elena's handwriting. It was for something called Elena's Special Bread, with a note at the bottom. Thomas loves this. It reminds him of his mother's baking. The second X yielded another tin, this one containing what appeared to be love tokens. A smooth stone from the creek, a bird's feather, a small carved wooden heart. These were the kinds of gifts young lovers exchange, simple but meaningful mementos of their time together. But it was the third X that revealed something that made my blood run cold. Buried deeper than the others, I found a leather journal. The final entry, dated October 31st, 1947, was written in my grandfather's shaky handwriting. Elena is gone. They said she left town, but I know better. God forgive me. I should have protected her. Chapter 5. The Journal's Dark Truth. I sat by the spring reading my grandfather's journal as the afternoon sun filtered through the oak trees. The entries began in the summer of 1947, documenting his growing love for Elena and their secret meetings. But as the weeks progressed, the tone became increasingly worried and fearful. My grandfather wrote about Elena's family being against their relationship, but not for the usual reasons. Elena came from a family of Italian immigrants, and apparently, there were people in town who didn't approve of their romance. The journal mentioned threatening letters, broken windows at Elena's family's store, and whispered warnings that Elena should know her place. The entries from September 1947 revealed that Elena had been receiving direct threats. Someone had left dead flowers on her doorstep with a note saying, "Foreign girls who don't listen disappear." My grandfather wrote about wanting to go to the sheriff, but Elena had begged him not to, saying it would only make things worse. The most chilling entry was from October 15, 1947. Elena missed our meeting tonight. Went to her house. Family says she left to visit relatives in Chicago, but her clothes are still there, and her mother was crying. Something terrible has happened. The men who've been threatening her, I think they've done something. My grandfather had spent weeks trying to find Elena, questioning people in town, even traveling to Chicago to look for her, but she had vanished completely as if she'd never existed. The final entries showed his descent into guilt and despair, blaming himself for not being brave enough to stand up to the threats, for not protecting the woman he loved. The last entry was the one I'd read earlier, followed by a single line added later in different ink. Married Margaret today. Elena would want me to be happy, but I'll never forget. Chapter 6. The Town's Buried Shame. I drove into town that evening, my mind reeling from what I'd discovered. I needed to know more about Elena, about what had really happened to her. My first stop was the local historical society, where Mrs. Henderson had been the keeper of town records for over 40 years. Mrs. Henderson was in her 80s, sharp as a tack, and had known my grandfather well. When I mentioned Elena's name, I saw something flicker in her eyes. Recognition. and something that looked like fear. "Where did you hear that name?" she asked, her voice suddenly cautious. I told her about finding the letters and photographs, about my grandfather's journal. Mrs. Henderson was quiet for a long moment. Then she locked the front door of the Historical Society and led me to her back office. "Your grandfather wasn't the only one who loved Elena Rossi," she said quietly. "She was the most beautiful girl in town, kind and smart. But this was 1947, and there were men here who believed certain people didn't belong." Mrs. Henderson pulled out a file she'd kept hidden for decades. It contained newspaper clippings from 1947, but not the kind that made it into the official archives. These were from a small underground newsletter that had documented the harassment of Italian families in our town during that period. Elena's disappearance was mentioned in the final issue of the newsletter, along with the names of 3 other young women who had left town under mysterious circumstances. The newsletter's editor had been forced to stop publishing after receiving death threats. "The official story was always that these girls left to find work in the cities," Mrs. Henderson explained. "But those of us who knew them understood the truth. They were driven away, or worse, by men who thought they were protecting the town's purity." She handed me a photograph from the file, a group of men standing in front of the town hall circa 1947. I recognized several names from local family histories, including one that made my stomach drop. Chapter 7. A name I recognized. The photograph showed 12 men in suits, standing proudly in front of a banner that read, "Citizens for Community Standards." Mrs. Henderson pointed to a man in the center of the group, tall, stern-faced, with cold eyes that seemed to stare right through the camera. "That's William Morrison," she said quietly. "He led the group that was discouraging certain relationships in town." Morrison. The name hit me like a punch to the gut. William Morrison was my grandmother Margaret's father, my great-grandfather. The man who had apparently driven Elena away was the same man who had welcomed my grandfather into his family just weeks later. "Your grandfather married Margaret Morrison in November 1947, Mrs. Henderson continued, watching my face carefully. "Just 3 weeks after Elena disappeared. It wasn't a coincidence." The pieces began falling into place with horrible clarity. My grandfather hadn't just lost Elena to random prejudice. He'd lost her to the family he would eventually join. William Morrison had eliminated his daughter's competition and then offered my grandfather a way out of his grief and guilt. Mrs. Henderson showed me more documents from her hidden file. There were records of property deals, business partnerships, and financial arrangements that painted a picture of how the Morrison family had consolidated power in our small town. They hadn't just driven away the undesirable families, they'd profited from it, buying their properties and businesses at below-market prices. "Your great-grandfather was a smart man," Mrs. Henderson said bitterly. "He knew that threatening Elena directly might push your grandfather to do something heroic. So instead, he made Elena disappear and then offered your grandfather everything he'd lost: security, acceptance, a future in this town." I thought about my grandmother Margaret, who had died when I was 12. She'd been a kind woman, but always seemed sad in a way I'd never understood. Now I wondered if she'd known the truth about how her marriage had begun. "What happened to Elena?" I asked, though I was afraid of the answer. Mrs. Henderson's expression grew even more grave. "That's what you need to find out." Chapter 8. The Search for Truth. I spent the next several days diving deeper into the mystery of Elena's disappearance. Mrs. Henderson had given me the names of a few elderly residents who might remember something, but most were reluctant to talk. The fear that had silenced people in 1947 seemed to still have power over them. Finally, I found someone willing to speak: Antonio Rossi, Elena's nephew, who was now in his 70s and living in the next county. When I called him and explained what I'd found, there was a long silence on the phone. "I've been waiting 70 years for someone to ask about my aunt," he said finally. "Can you come see me tomorrow?" Antonio lived in a small house surrounded by the kind of garden Elena had apparently loved. He welcomed me with coffee and old photo albums, his eyes bright with unshed tears as he talked about the aunt he'd adored. Elena was going to be a teacher, he told me, showing me pictures of a vibrant young woman surrounded by children. She was the first person in our family to finish high school, and she had a scholarship to the Teachers College in the state capital. But then she fell in love with your grandfather? Antonio's family had tried to warn Elena about the growing hostility in town, but she'd been convinced that love could overcome prejudice. She'd believed that if she and my grandfather were patient and careful, they could eventually be together openly. The last time I saw her was October 30th, 1947, Antonio said, his voice heavy with old grief. She came to our house that night, terrified. She said men had been following her, that someone had left a note saying she had 24 hours to leave town or face the consequences. Elena had begged her family to go to the police, but they'd been too frightened. The harassment had been escalating for weeks, and they knew the sheriff was friends with William Morrison. She said she was going to meet Thomas one last time to tell him goodbye and to give him something important, Antonio continued. She never came home. Chapter 9. The Final Meeting. Antonio's words echoed in my mind as I drove back to the farm. Elena had gone to meet my grandfather one last time, to give him something important. But according to his journal, she'd never shown up for their meeting. What had happened between her leaving her family's house and the spring where they usually met? I decided to search the area around the spring more thoroughly. If Elena had made it to their meeting place, there might be some trace of what had happened to her. I brought my metal detector and began systematically covering every inch of ground within 100 yards of the spring. It was nearly sunset when the detector began beeping insistently near a large oak tree about 50 feet from the spring. The signal was strong and deep, suggesting something substantial buried several feet down. I began digging as the last light faded, using my truck's headlights to illuminate the area. 3 feet down, my shovel hit something hard. As I cleared away more dirt, I realized I'd found a wooden box, about the size of a small suitcase. The wood was rotted in places, but the metal hinges and lock were still intact. My hands shook as I lifted it from the hole. Inside the box, wrapped in what had once been a white dress, were human remains. I sat back on my heels, staring at the terrible discovery. There was also a small purse containing identification papers with Elena's name and a letter addressed to my grandfather. The letter was water-damaged and barely readable, but I could make out enough to understand its contents. Elena had been pregnant. She'd come to the spring that night to tell my grandfather they were going to have a child, to ask him to run away with her before William Morrison's threats became reality. But she'd never made it to their meeting place. Someone had intercepted her, and this oak tree had become her grave. The letter ended with words that broke my heart. Thomas, if something happens to me, know that I loved you and our baby more than life itself. Please don't let them win. Chapter 10. Confronting the Past. I spent that night sitting by Elena's grave, trying to process the magnitude of what I'd discovered. My grandfather hadn't just lost his first love, he'd lost his first child as well, and he'd never known either truth. Elena had died trying to reach him, carrying their secret to her grave. The next morning, I called the sheriff's department. Detective Rodriguez arrived within an hour, and I showed her everything I'd found, the letters, the journal, the photographs, and finally, Elena's remains. She listened to the story with growing amazement and anger. This is going to reopen a lot of old wounds, she warned me. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my grandfather, who had carried guilt and grief for over 50 years without knowing the full truth. I thought about Elena, who had died alone and afraid, her dreams buried with her. I thought about the child who had never had a chance to live. The truth needs to come out, I said. Detective Rodriguez began the process of treating Elena's death as a homicide, even though most of the likely perpetrators were long dead. She interviewed Antonio Rossi and Mrs. Henderson, gathering evidence of the systematic harassment that had led to Elena's murder. The investigation revealed that William Morrison and his Citizens for Community Standards had been responsible for the disappearances of at least 4 young women between 1946 and 1948. Elena's case was the only one where remains were found, but the pattern was clear. Mrs. Henderson finally revealed documents she'd been hiding for decades, meeting minutes from Morrison's group that detailed their plans to remove undesirable elements from the community. The language was coded, but the intent was unmistakable. "Your great-grandfather was a monster," Detective Rodriguez told me bluntly. "And your grandfather was as much a victim as Elena was." The revelation that William Morrison had orchestrated Elena's murder to clear the way for his daughter's marriage to my grandfather added another layer of horror to the story. Chapter 11. Family Revelations. I knew I had to tell my family what I'd discovered, but I wasn't sure how to begin. My father was still alive, living in the retirement community about an hour away. At 82, he'd known my grandfather well and might have insights into the man's hidden grief. When I visited my father and told him about finding Elena's letters, his reaction surprised me. Instead of shock, I saw recognition in his eyes. I wondered when someone would finally find those, he said quietly. Your grandfather used to disappear for hours at a time, especially around the anniversary of his first wedding. I followed him once when I was about 12. He went to the spring and just sat there, talking to someone who wasn't there. My father had always known there was a sadness in his father that went beyond normal grief. My grandfather had been a good husband to Margaret and a loving father, but there had been a part of him that seemed unreachable. He used to have nightmares, my father continued. He'd wake up calling for someone named Elena. Your grandmother pretended not to notice, but I could see it hurt her. The revelation that my grandmother had known about Elena added another tragic dimension to the story. Margaret Morrison had lived her entire marriage knowing she was second choice, knowing her father had eliminated her competition through violence. Do you think she knew what her father had done? I asked. My father was quiet for a long moment. I think she suspected. Near the end of her life, she made me promise to take care of the spring, to never let anyone disturb it. She said there were old sorrows buried there that deserved respect. I realized that my grandmother had probably known about Elena's grave all along. She'd spent 50 years protecting the resting place of her husband's first love, carrying the weight of her father's crimes in silence. The complexity of the family dynamics was staggering. My grandfather grieving for Elena while trying to love Margaret. Margaret living with the knowledge of her father's violence while protecting Elena's memory, and my father growing up in a house haunted by unspoken truths. Chapter 12. Justice and Healing. The investigation into Elena's death made national news, highlighting the forgotten history of violence against immigrant communities in small-town America. Elena's story became a symbol of the countless victims whose disappearances had been covered up or ignored. Antonio Rossi, now the last surviving member of Elena's immediate family, worked with authorities to give his aunt a proper burial. The service was held at the Catholic church in town, attended by hundreds of people who had never known Elena but were moved by her story. I spoke at the service, reading from one of Elena's letters about her dreams of becoming a teacher, her love for children, and her hope for a better future. I also read my grandfather's words about his regret and guilt, finally giving voice to the grief he'd carried in silence. The town council voted to rename the park near the spring Elena Rossi Memorial Park, and a scholarship was established in her name for young women pursuing education degrees. It felt like a small step toward justice, but an important one. Detective Rodriguez's investigation led to the discovery of 2 more burial sites on properties that had once belonged to members of Morrison's group. The remains were too degraded for identification, but they were given respectful burials alongside Elena. Mrs. Henderson donated her hidden files to the State Historical Society, ensuring that the full truth about the Citizens for Community Standards would be preserved for future generations. The official town history was rewritten to include the stories of the families who had been driven away or worse. For me, the most healing moment came when I was able to reunite Elena with my grandfather. I had his body moved from the town cemetery to a plot next to Elena's new grave, finally bringing together the lovers who had been separated by hatred and violence. The headstone I commissioned read, "Thomas and Elena, together at last." Chapter 13. New Beginnings. 6 months after discovering Elena's letters, I stood by the spring watching my young grandson play in the grass nearby. The water ran clear and sweet, just as my grandfather had always said, but now I understood the full weight of the history that flowed beneath its surface. Sarah and I had decided to stay on the farm, but we'd made changes. The area around Elena's original grave site had been turned into a memorial garden, planted with the same flowers she'd grown in her secret garden 70 years ago. We'd found the original layout in my grandfather's drawings and recreated it as closely as possible. The spring itself had been restored and protected, with a small plaque telling Elena's story for future visitors. School groups came regularly to learn about the history of immigration and prejudice in their community, using Elena's story as a starting point for discussions about tolerance and justice. I'd also started a foundation in Elena's name, providing legal aid for immigrant families facing harassment or discrimination. It felt like a way to honor her memory, while preventing similar tragedies from happening to others. My relationship with my own family history had been completely transformed. Instead of the simple story of hard-working farmers I'd grown up with, I now understood the complex legacy of love, loss, courage, and cowardice that had shaped our family's path. Most importantly, I'd learned that secrets buried in the ground have a way of demanding to be uncovered. Elena had waited 70 years for someone to tell her story, to seek justice for her murder, to remember her dreams and her love. As I watched my grandson chase butterflies through Elena's garden, I made a silent promise to never let her story be forgotten again. The truth had been painful to uncover, but it had also been healing. Elena Rossi would be remembered not just as a victim, but as a young woman full of hope and love whose life had mattered. The spring continued to flow, carrying with it the memory of all who had come before, and the promise of truth for all who would come after.